Hello there again. In this week, we deal with NATO, and actually, we are looking at how NATO develops in the current situation, global changing power relations, and actually how it operates as an organization. I really have the pleasure today to introduce someone to you whose name you may have actually heard quite a bit before. It is the privilege to have Jamie Shea today with us. Actually, very much welcome to this interview.
Thank you, Madeline. Nice to be with you.
Thank you. Actually, let me start out asking, you are dealing now with emerging security challenges. And it would be very interesting for us to know what kind of challenges do we see currently and what kind of challenges could we actually be facing in the future?
Well, we see, I think, two types of challenge. The first challenge is assertive states. You have Russia at the moment, which has annexed illegally part of the territory of another country, Ukraine. As you know, Russia has annexed Crimea, and which is asserting military power once again in Eastern Europe to dictate outcomes, even putting pressure on some of our NATO allies, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe. So even though we thought that we had left that kind of problem behind at the end of the Cold War in the late 1980s, unfortunately we have to realise that great power confrontations are still something that could dominate in the 21st century. So NATO, to some degree, cannot afford to neglect its traditional task, the task that my generation, your generation, Madeline, associates with NATO, which is to say collective defence, defence of territory, defence of borders, and we've responded to the Russian actions by organising more exercises, more deployments of NATO forces on the territory of our new member states to provide them with reassurance and to make sure that NATO territory is never threatened or challenged. But what's different from the Cold War, when we were dealing only with state-on-state confrontations and rivalries, what's different today is that, of course, in the last 2 decades, a number of so-called transnational threats have emerged. Things like cyber attacks, which can be organised by the hacker in the garage. One single individual can now bring down an air traffic control system. So, of course, we have to take action against those kind of threats. We have now threats to critical infrastructure as we become more and more dependent upon globalised supply chains, particularly for our energy, for instance. We have issues of climate change and severe weather conditions. You see, for example, Hurricane Katrina in the United States or Superstorm Haiyan in the Philippines, which sometimes can necessitate a military intervention to deal with the consequences. And of course, you have issues like weapons of mass destruction. And unfortunately, although, yes, thank God, there hasn't been a major attack on NATO territory from a terrorist organisation for some years, we know that Al-Qaeda is alive and well in the Sahel, throughout much of the Middle East and Northern Africa, so we can't write that off. So in other words, to use an expression of a previous NATO Secretary General, we have to be able to ride two horses in the circus at the same time to deal with the return of big states with big military power and assertiveness, but also to keep our eye on the rest of the world and these transnational threats which can still affect our society, our economy, or the lives of our citizens.
Actually, it seems that for quite a long time we haven't had a situation where there needed to be a true kind of classical joining of forces in the true sense of the defense organization. But it seems then NATO is undergoing some changes, and maybe I think I've also heard you say it is transforming into a broader security organization.
Well, yes, I mean, we have to be able to do three things, and sometimes even at once. The first thing we have to do, as I mentioned earlier, is collective defence. That's still the heart of the alliance. That's Article 5. That's the reason why most countries, frankly, have joined NATO, Madeline, for the security umbrella. And again, we thought after the Cold War maybe this wasn't going to be needed so much, but it's still very important, which means that if one allied member is attacked, it can count on the collective response of everybody else, including, of course, the United States and Canada from the other side of the Atlantic. But, of course, that's not to fight a war. That's with the intention of avoiding a war in the first place. We call that deterrence, of course. The second thing, though, is crisis management. We've all seen in the last couple of years with piracy in the Gulf of Aden, with the humanitarian operation in Libya to stop a massacre taking place in Benghazi, with the effort to stabilise Afghanistan, with the intervention interventions in Kosovo or Bosnia, closer to home in the Balkans. The NATO has been called upon quite frequently to deploy military forces outside Europe, not to fight major wars, but to try to stabilise difficult situations, which in some cases, like the Taliban in Afghanistan, could threaten our security. And again, maybe we're coming home from Afghanistan now and Libya is over and the Balkans are peaceful, but nobody could say that we would not be called upon in the future to do that again. But the third part, which goes also to the heart of your question, is what we call cooperative security, which absolutely is right. The best way to avoid security problems is by bringing like-minded states together to cooperate. And today, NATO has 28 members, but we have almost double that number of partners. We had the Japanese Prime Minister here last week wanting to cooperate with us on cyber, on naval issues, on counterterrorism. We have in Afghanistan nearly 30 countries which are not NATO countries contributing to our operation. We have partnerships in North Africa, in the Gulf. So we want to keep those partnerships so that we can continue among like-minded countries to work together to deal with security problems. And by building that cooperation, we prevent threats from arising in the first place. So it may be challenging, but there's no choice. You can't do one and just skip the others. You've got to be able to do all three.
So there is a large part of actually focusing on the prevention of conflict compared to also getting in when things have started.
It's like medicine. Prevention is a million times better, but also much cheaper than cure. For example, we did a study the other day which showed that if you go early to a crisis area and help to train the local forces, for example in Africa or the Middle East, to deal with their security challenges themselves, on average that is 1/26th cheaper than having to deploy a big NATO or a big Western force to do the job like we've done in Afghanistan. So certainly that's one aspect. But of course the other aspect is being able to anticipate crises. And frankly, our record, nobody's record, is very good in that area. Too many times we're taken by surprise, or we say, like a famous British historian of the French Revolution, nobody predicted it, but afterwards everybody knew that it was inevitable. Well, so we have to try, and we're making a big effort at the moment in NATO, using our intelligence services, using what we call strategic foresight analysis, looking a little bit at trends, to try to get a sense of where the next crisis may develop. It's never going to be perfect, but we could do better than we've done in the past. And then, of course, to engage NATO and our partners early on to take those preventive measures. As somebody who personally lived 10 years of his life almost permanently in the Balkans with the collapse of Yugoslavia, I well remember that if we had acted immediately once Dubrovnik was shelled in 1992, there would be at least 100,000 people in the Balkans who would be alive today because the war could have been stopped. We didn't do it, there was then a war, and NATO had to come in at the end to tidy up once the mess had been created. So it really doesn't make sense not to do prevention. We just have to learn to do it better.
Actually, it seems that if you look, for example, at a important international organization such as the UN Security Council, we know it can sometimes be blocked because we have divergent preferences within the organization. Now, we do know that, of course, in NATO, very often we work on the basis of similar perceptions, beliefs. But isn't there, given the number of members, also the big challenge of coordinating?
Well, yes, I'd be totally honest, of course. We're all democracies, and democracies have their own views, and they don't always agree. And people don't like to do something unless they have debated it. Nobody wants to be ordered to do something. NATO is only successful because the countries here feel that they've debated the issue, they've compromised, they've come to a reasonable solution, and then they can identify with it. Now, that sometimes means that, yes, NATO doesn't act in 24 hours because we have to debate. But what it does mean is that when we launch an operation, we stick to it. The countries that have agreed to do it, do it. We've been in Kosovo for 15 years. We've been in Afghanistan for longer than World War I or World War II. We've shown great staying power precisely because countries feel my voice has been heard, I've had my say, I'm participating in the decision making, I'm sharing in the command structure, and therefore this is not something that I've been ordered to do by somebody else. So I actually believe that this is a kind of strength rather than a weakness in terms of how we operate.
the moment a decision is taken, then indeed.
Yes. If you've participated in something and you've co-decided, you are obliged to stick with it. You assume the responsibility. You can't turn around and say, "Oh, that big country there told me to do it, and therefore I can quit the minute that I don't feel happy any longer." That's why NATO is a much better organisation for doing these things than a so-called coalition of the willing, where people sort of opt in and opt out every 5 minutes, and where generally you don't get anywhere like the same staying power over not just years, but in fact, as I said, even decades now.
Is there a risk that maybe if we watch the activities of NATO, that we tend to focus on the very salient events that we see on television, and we kind of may not be seeing other work? Is that a risk for NATO, and maybe the risk NATO is being perceived?
Well, yes, it's a good question, and of course it's always a risk because you know politics. Politicians focus on what's on the front pages of the newspapers. They're very busy people. They often don't have time for something that may or may not happen in Lower Ruritania in a month's time. That's the problem, as I said, with prevention. It's proving that something is bad and needs attention before it actually happens. When it happens, everybody knows it's bad, and then they're forced to react. But I think we live in democracies which are very burdened with all kinds of issues, and so we have to be realistic there. But it's very important also to recognise today that, as I said earlier, NATO has to ride two horses in the circus at the same time. Because unlike the Cold War, when virtually every problem was linked to the central confrontation between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, or the United States and the Soviet Union, as it then was, today there are lots of problems that have nothing to do with Ukraine and nothing to do with Russia. Al-Qaeda in Africa isn't going on vacation because NATO is occupied with Ukraine. The pirates are not going to say, "Hey, let's keep our ships in shore until NATO can come back to deal with us again." Iran is not slowing down its nuclear programs because of Russia or Ukraine. The crisis in Syria is not stopping. So clearly we have to be mindful not only of what is urgent but also what is important, and we have to keep our eye on the rest of the world. Yes, it's demanding, but that's the price of being secure. For example, if you're in the south of Europe, Ukraine of course is very important, but refugees coming across the Mediterranean into Lampedusa, drug trafficking, human trafficking across the Mediterranean, those are problems that you are facing now, every day, and which are destabilising your societies. So if NATO is going to be a relevant organisation, it can't just take care of one member's problems. It has to take care of all members' problems. But of course it also means generosity. Let me give you an example. You would be very surprised to hear that in the last couple of weeks, Poland and Estonia, notwithstanding the pressure from Russia on their borders, have sent troops to the Central African Republic as part of a European Union mission. France, notwithstanding all of its focus on Mali and the Central African Republic, sent 1,000 troops for an exercise in the Baltic states recently. So we need also a little bit of generosity, that I'll help you with your problem, but in return I expect you also to help me with mine. That's what we call solidarity.
If you had the choice again, if you would need to see which organization you would like to work for, would you choose NATO again?
Well, yes, and I'm not only going to say that because I can't say no, given that I'm a NATO employee, but I feel in my life that I've been privileged to work in an organisation which is still relatively small. It's tiny compared with the United Nations, not that bureaucratic, where it's possible from the top of the organisation to the bottom to get to know everybody and to work with everybody, and where frankly the agenda is never the same. I spent the first 10 years dealing with nuclear weapons, the next 10 years dealing with the Balkans. If you'd have told me when I walked in here that I would have to go to Afghanistan, or I would travel to Libya or Asia, I would be dealing with cyber, when I didn't even know what a computer was in 1980, I would have recommended you to go for psychiatric treatment. But in reality, this is what's happened. So I think it's also the diversity of the issues which keeps you fresh. Your brain can't go to sleep because every now and again you have to reprogram it to deal with a different type of security challenge.
And it seems we indeed are continually facing these kind of challenges.
Well, NATO's job is to provide security for its members, and if security changes, then NATO has to change. Otherwise, it becomes irrelevant and goes out of existence. So adaptation is key. But the principles, which is burden sharing, solidarity, the generosity, I take care of your problem, you take care of mine, that balance of interests, the consultation, in other words, we discuss things freely, nobody is railroaded into a decision that they don't want to take. Those principles are eternal and they're the basis of NATO's success. So on the one hand, yes, adapt, but on the other hand, be true to the formula which has made you successful in the past.
I think on that note, let me thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity as well.